Hello and welcome to Deep in Pact, a proud member of the Duff Network, where we dive deep into Wildbow's most diabolical work 5 years on. Coming up next is Elliot Diebold.
And that was Ruben Morehouse.
And we are back to talk about Conviction 5.3. We open in the cell as Blake is kind of struggling to define the characteristics of who he is as he leaves them in a puddle of blood on his floor.
I love that introduction you just gave. That was fantastic. Well done. Because that's exactly what is happening. Blake is having an existential crisis as he is dripping his very essence all over the place.
A very literal existential crisis, not the usual, usual kind of existential crisis. Well, yeah, both. You're right.
And I mean, because this chapter begins to answer a question that Blake and I have sort of been holding on to since Arc 2, and that's Blake is explicitly raising that question to open the chapter, which is what exactly does it mean to give away all of your power? Like, it's clearly more than, as we've already said, losing blood and feeling dizzy. Yeah. But it's been a little unclear until now.
Yeah, and this chapter is kind of Blake discovering more and more things that happen as the side effects of him losing him.
Yeah.
And we kind of seed that theme here where Blake notices the real world getting fuzzier and harder to focus on, but Evan and Rose remain sharp. They remain clear. And, going through this chapter for the first time, we're not really sure why that is. Like, is it because he's attached to them? Is it because they're others?
Because at first I was like, oh, well, he's attached to Rose. That makes sense. But then it was Evan as well, and he's not attached to Evan yet.
Yes.
So I was a little confused on the first read through, but you're right. The second read through, yeah, it becomes clear that he's leaving behind the Blake part of himself, and the practitioner side, the other side, is remaining, and so he's kind of becoming more other and getting more into the other side of stuff. Yeah, becoming more Rose, which contrasts with what we see from Rose a bit later in the chapter. But we'll get there.
Yeah, that's a good point. So Blake does a little trick where he basically kind of just is able to get out of the cell because he's so not Blake anymore that people don't even really seem to notice that he just kind of leaves the cell and tries to hurry away before Duncan discovers what he's up to.
Yeah, well, he sort of cuts these connections, but I think under normal circumstances, those connections would have reformed more readily as somebody who's dripping blood everywhere walks past you. But he's kind of fading out of existence, I guess, a bit. So, like there's this bit where two paramedics rush by him, and he draws a circle of blood around himself so that they don't see him, and they run past, and Blake sort of smirks, which is like an oddly arrogant and positive emotion to be feeling in this situation where it's like, haha, I've drained myself of so much blood, you can't even see me. Take that.
Haha, paramedics, I'm bleeding everywhere, but you can't find me.
It's a really hollow victory in my book, but Blake seems really proud of himself.
Yeah, maybe the more other Blake becomes, that manifests as smugness for him. So Blake kind of gets into a staircase to get down to the ground floor, and as he kind of stumbles down the stairs, blood and feathers start falling off of him, which is such a bizarre little moment. And Blake, kind of in his unfocused state, gets distracted looking at his tattoos, seeming to be losing feathers. Such a cool moment.
Yeah, I literally stopped and said, what the fuck, when I read this. I think I say this every time Blake's tattoos come up, but I still don't feel like I understand all the metaphors and stuff that they represent. And maybe it's because I'm trying too hard to quantify it. It's the sort of scientist / engineer in me trying to tie it all to literally. Maybe I think more literal. No, more metaphoric, more symbolically.
I want to read out the quote here because it is such a WTF moment, right? Blake thinks, I looked down for the source of the feathers and I saw my tattoos. 3 of the birds were beheaded or partially beheaded, the cuts intersecting their faces and necks, the other parts of their bodies already gone. Like, shit.
And then his response at the end of this paragraph, is, huh? Which is
so nonchalant.
Like, I can't tell if that's just Blake or if he's just so out of it he can't muster up an appropriate response, or both. But that jumped out to me almost as much as the brutal description of these birds. I was like, that is not an appropriate reaction to seeing what you have deduced as a symbol of your being decapitated. It's not okay.
Yeah, I would, if I don't know, I think Blake is pretty out of it, and so I think we should be a bit charitable to him, not taking this as seriously as he should. Or maybe he just kind of realizes, I fucked myself up here. Like, I don't need to see the birds to know that.
Yeah, that's true. This isn't exactly news.
Yeah. Anyway, so Blake kind of staggers along down these stairs and is basically filling Rose in on what she's missed. The trials, the framing for murder, all these are fun times. And they talk about this so intensely that they don't really realize they're stuck in an MC Escher staircase.
Yeah, I love these sort of cliff notes. It hurts to talk summaries from Blake, where he's just giving her like the shortest possible explanations of each bit individually, and it's like, it must be so frustrating for Rose because she's basically having to prod him for every piece of information. Like, he gives her half answers that just raise more questions.
It really reminds me of a parent kind of trying to prod their child for what happened today at school, and they just get all these like one word answers. Blake is disinterested at the best of times, and now is not the best of times.
There's also this great bit where, as soon as Evan sort of comes up, Rose's first question is, how did you bind him? And then after that, her next question, or her next comment is like, using souls is different to ghosts. And it's so Rose, she's instantly thinking about like the law and the, for lack of a better word, the science of
the
Evan's
details,
situation.
the finer details of it.
Whereas, like, none of that has even crossed Blake's mind in like the last 5 chapters. It's just, that's just Evan. It's not... He's not a soul or even a ghost or who gives a shit. It's just Evan. It's a great little moment, just as Rose has come back, that helps highlight the differences between them. It's pretty great. I love, we get Rose back and straight away we're seeing how much of a like improviser Blake is, and how it's like with the glamour where Rose is pointing out, oh, that shouldn't have worked. It's Rose pointing out the flaws in what has somehow managed to work for him. I guess there's definitely room to overthink in this world. Fel talked a lot about saturating yourself with knowledge, and I guess Blake has avoided that so far.
Yes, but it's also possible to underthink, as Blake kind of realizes that he does here, where he kind of is talking about, oh, I'm able to just kind of focus on one thing and I get tunnel vision, but I can actually focus. It's awesome. And then he just kind of keeps describing how he reaches a landing and keeps rushing downstairs. Evan tells him at one point the front door is 1 floor down, and Blake passes 4 different landings before he realizes that he's just stuck in a loop.
Yeah, I mean, that was funny. I didn't actually count that. Like, the first time going through, I didn't notice that at all. I was way too engrossed in the conversation and Blake's focus on his tunnel vision or lack thereof, which is exactly what Blake and Rose did. So I think the writing works really well, because, again, you go back and read it, and it's exactly like you said. There's 4 times where he takes note of the fact that he's turning around and he's hit the landing, and that doesn't make sense when they're only heading 1 floor down.
Yeah, I think it works great because it also does give you a bit of this sense of, well, how high up were they anyway before it kind of hits? Like, you're just starting to be a bit concerned that something's going on, and then Blake realizes at the same time you do. It's awesome.
Yeah. And so there's this moment where Blake, he's getting that tunnel vision, and then he tries to undo it basically and go the other way when he realizes that it's limiting him.
Yeah.
And he finds it a lot harder to go back to having blurry general awareness than he did to focus in and tunnel vision. Yeah. And I don't know if we've got a concrete answer yet as for why it was harder. Like, Blake sort of wonders a bit, but I'm wondering if maybe it's because as he's transitioning to becoming a bit more othery, there's a natural inclination to become a bit more focused, I guess, in one specific avenue. Like we see most others are sort of centered around some sort of core idea, and maybe that's sort of what was starting to happen to Blake.
Yeah, they do get the sense of being specialists rather than generalists, right? So I think that could be an explanation of this. Yeah. So, yeah, Blake has got himself caught in another weird mind-bending chronomancy trap, which, Laird and Duncan, they're jerks, but I do love this kind of, weird mind-bending trap shenanigans that they always pull.
Yeah, and so I've got something here in my notes that I just had a good laugh, because I wrote this, and then I scrolled down, because you'd done a pass of notes first, and you'd written the same thing, just 2 paragraphs down, which is... This would be so much fun for escape rooms. It's a little escape room that Blake finds himself in for the majority of this chapter. And you just think, if the practitioners could put all the violence away and just make cool escape rooms, the world would be a much better place.
Yeah, wouldn't everyone be happier? Others could just, instead of tormenting humans through, torture and shit, they'd torment them through mind-bending, frustration puzzles.
Yeah, well, it's like Saw, but with magic.
Saw, but nicer, yeah. Anyway, so, the gang realizes, oh shit, there's a rune that's making these stairs loop, and Evan kind of tries to reach through the wall to break it, but it's salted, so he can't. But there is a window in this stairwell, and, Blake sees that, and an idea starts to form.
Yeah, but before Evan points the window out to Blake, which is a little funny moment in and of itself, Rose has already run off to see what she can do with her newfound bonus power from Blake. But there's a little argument...
blood power.
Yeah. But there's a little argument that they have before she goes, because Blake is basically like, you need to go do something, and Rose is very hesitant to do that. And obviously it's been a while since we got to really talk about Rose in a way that is sort of about her, because she's sort of been defined for the last arc by her absence. But she spends most of her time justifiably complaining that Blake never lets her do anything. And now we have this situation where he is like, can you do something? And she says no. And I don't want to be unfair to her. This is not an ideal situation to be called to bat. This is very stressful, but she sort of hesitates to even try and experiment with what Blake has given her, and we see how valuable what he has given her is later. But it felt very Rose to me that there's this sort of, even though she always complains that Blake doesn't let her do things, she is quite a hesitant, she likes to plan things out. She's not an improvisational person, and so she hesitates when Blake does ask her to just go and try and figure shit out.
Well, this is, as you said, at the core of their characters, I think it's fair to define Blake as likes improvising, is good at improvising. Rose is the planner, right?
I think that's fair.
And I don't know. We don't know for sure how much time there has been since Rose came back and this whole thing started. They left the cell and all that stuff, but it's not a lot of time. I don't think there was much planning time in there. So, really, Rose was in a window outside Isadora's office, and since then it's been all improv.
I get the impression for her it feels like it's probably been 5 minutes.
Exactly.
And so feeling overwhelmed is more than justifiable, but it did sort of stand out to me, because she does usually complain that she doesn't get to do anything, and now we see that it's a bit more than that. It's that also when she does get to do things, it's not in the situation that she would prefer.
Yeah, definitely. They're stuck in this stairwell. It does have this. It has this escape room vibe. They're just they don't really have a set way out, so they're just trying to mess with different runes until they find the right combo to get out.
Yeah, Blake just starts kicking windows.
Yeah.
Which don't do that in real escape rooms. They're not fans of it.
Rose, I like there's a point actually where Blake, he thinks, maybe I should just punch the wall really, really hard. Maybe that would help. Anyway, obviously he doesn't do that. He's not that delirious, luckily. So Rose, kind of realizes that she's stronger than she was before with this blood magic, right? And she's able to break the window, and it takes a little bit to break it. It takes 2 tries, but she breaks it, and she seems kind of fine, right?
And there's an implication from what she says that the first try wasn't even she didn't go all out. She just sort of whacked it a bit, and she's like, oh wow, this is easier than it was before, and so then she really gives it a proper whack. But she comments that she's very much stronger now than she was before.
Yeah, and, with that opening, Blake takes a run up and he does a little big old wind-boosted jump, and he jumps right out of the window to safety almost, except he just kind of gets looped back inside above the stairwell and falls back down to the ground.
Yeah, it's like this really ungraceful Super Mario one-screen jump where he does this giant 3-meter tall jump and then just sort of gets carried back into the room and flops down on the stairs. I loved this moment. It was glorious to read. Just it goes from so victorious, like you can just picture this very uplifting score going on, and then as he passes through the window, it just all goes to hell.
Flowing in the wind.
Yeah, it's all in slow mo. Yeah.
And Duncan has caught up to them at this point. Duncan, is in the stairwell now, and he kind of is standing above Blake, who is now just lying on the ground after falling back down to the stairs. And there's a moment where Duncan's like standing over him, and Blake kind of mutters something, trying to bait Duncan to come closer so that Rose can grab him. But Duncan just doesn't move at all, and Blake doesn't even realize that it hasn't worked until he has to look up later to realize, oh, of course he didn't fall for this really basic trap.
Yeah, it's this real moment of nice try, but no.
But no dice.
But so regardless, Rose does sort of have a crack anyway when they've realized it hasn't worked, and she manages to shove her arm out of the mirror, which is like that's a big development that the chapter doesn't
and Duncan
really
grabs her arm.
Yeah, and the chapter doesn't really get a chance to focus in on that, but that's a huge development. Like, so far, all of the talk of Rose doing things has been in the context of Blake gets a domain and sets it up so Vestigius
and then he can break the rules,
can come in and out. Now we're seeing, if he gets a decent amount of power from that domain or a familiar, he might be able to feed some of it into Rose and she can get more and more corporeal, which is, like, a big deal. Her potential versatility for the rest of the story just drastically increased.
Definitely. So Duncan kind of is wise to some of Blake's tricks, and so he gets Evan to run off, giving him a chance to come and advance on Blake with a taser. But Evan comes back. Evan has run downstairs and then looped to back above stairs, kind of stands behind Duncan and screams into his ear, basically, which spooks him, gives Blake and Rose a chance to get away. There's a little bit of a scuffle before Blake breaks another one of Duncan's runes and jumps through the window, this time successfully landing outside.
Yes, so second time was the charm in this case for his giant leap out the window.
Who needs a third time around?
Well, Blake probably will at the end of this chapter, from the sounds of it. But, Duncan also does a bit of a villain monologue here, and he explains that part of the reason the Behames are so arrogant is because when you're studying time, which is this big, immovable sort of constant force, like time can't be messed with, and so people who mess with time get this sense that they can't be messed with, and sort of, that's why they're smug, just because, it's not their fault, it's just because they're chronomancers.
Yep, sure. whatever, man.
Yeah, whatever, Duncan.
If you say so.
But he also kind of talks a bit more about how he doesn't often get a chance to do much for the family. And, thinking about all the things he said so far this arc, I wonder if maybe this is a bit of a sore point for old Dunko, where, maybe he is sort of the Bahame that got shoved off to the distant city of Toronto to be a cop in a shitty little beat, and I wonder if that's a bit of a weakness Blake might get to exploit later,
Not
to
just
bait
that.
him into something.
If I was a Bahame, like the basic, from what we understand, the way their family works is they all kind of pay power into this pot, and then the family kind of uses it for bigger things, like the ritual that kind of fucked over the access to the house, and you get the sense that this is a bigger ritual as well that maybe is taking some power from the family pot. It would suck to be a practitioner and to just have to constantly pay, I don't know, income tax to your family constantly.
Yeah, true.
Maybe there's a chance for Blake to win over old Duncan here, but he does seem to be a lot of a loyalist.
Or maybe not win him over, but bait him into doing something stupid by, playing that weakness.
Yeah, true. So there's this really cinematic moment when Blake jumps out the window. I'm going to read it out because it's awesome. Something, a lot of somethings broke all through the building. My exit was followed by a spray of glass, blood-stained feathers, and dust. The wind rune's wake, perhaps, or the change in pressure that came with the breaking of the effect in the stairwell, releasing the pent-up energy and whatever else. It's such a cool cinematic moment. I want the Pact adaptation where we see Blake sailing through the air with a cloud of feathers and dust and glass shattering behind him as he lands outside. It's an awesome image.
Yeah, it's fantastic, and yeah, you can't help but just visualize it in this sort of slow-mo, heavily CGI'd effect.
Yeah, and so Blake sails through the air and lands outside, sort of. He hasn't quite landed outside, more landed on the other side, seeing visions of a kind of twisted mirror version of reality.
Yeah, and so Rose kind of gives him a speech on how she thinks he's sort of sinking, and then she also uses the term slipping through the cracks, which from the looks of it, jumped out to both of us as connecting to Marcy, the girlfriend of the shotgun, the girlfriend of the son of the shotgun knight.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I mean, I wonder if this is going to be, Blake's expedition slightly into the world of the others is going to be a useful thing when it comes to the Erasure Demon.
Yeah, it's a good point. And Rose is kind of explaining a bit about this place, theoretical place. She calls it the spirit analog to the deep wilderness. No shit? I asked. Sometimes there's shit, she said. That's like a robot level of not understanding idioms. It's crazy how much this must be intentional. That's too wild for her to not understand that idiom.
Yeah, I agree. The way she just immediately uses it to segue into kind of what she was already talking about makes me think that she must have just been doing a little bit, because it's I mean, either that or it's like some weird thing where answering his question was related to karma and being forsworn or something, but I don't really buy that. I think she's just being a bit of a smart ass back to him.
Yeah, I like the idea of, it's kind of how you treat a child, right? Like sometimes they say weird things and you kind of half play along with them just so you can get back to making your point to them. That kind of feels like what she's doing. Like, sometimes there's shit and blood and all this other stuff that I was already going to talk about.
Yeah.
So, Blake sees this weird upside down world and decides, no dice, I preferred it in the police station. And so he decides to go back in there and do something. It isn't immediately sure what. Immediately obvious what.
I disagree with that. I think it was pretty obvious. Blake doesn't spell it out, but maybe it's just me, because every time Blake talks about how drained he is, or how he's relying on the glamour. So for the last 3 arcs, I've just constantly been sitting here every time I read it going, get a familiar. You need a new source of power. Get a domain. Get a familiar. Like if this was me, I really would have tried to solidify myself as a top priority. So that it's just always at the front of my mind. So as soon as he was going back in, I was like, yeah, do the Evan thing. You got to get... I actually thought, but to be fair, I thought he was going to get Evan's body. I didn't figure he was going to try and do the ritual.
Do the ritual right there. Yeah. Yeah. It does become apparent that Blake wants to go back in to do a familiar ritual, and Rose kind of objects to this at first, which, yeah, I think it's a reasonable objection.
Yeah, I think we'll talk about this for a couple of minutes. This is going to be a thing, because this is really important. And so, first of all, her first objection is just based on the fact that he's a soul. Like, again, it's very practical, like discussing the systems of Pact.
Sure.
But then, yeah, it turns into more of a full-blown argument between the two. And I find it very difficult to sort of pick a side.
Yeah. So basically, I think Rose's objection here is, this is a big decision. You're marrying a child. Like, I need to think about it. I've only been back alive for 10 minutes. And Blake's response is, well, I'm sorry, but we don't have time to think about it. It's like now or never. We're not going to be able to get back into this police station.
Well, and I mean, things aren't going to go well for them if they don't pull something out of left field. Like they both have really valid points. So it's really hard to kind of call one of them out for being wrong or right, because it's a big decision for Rose, and
Yeah.
she's having to make it under duress, which isn't really fair. Like Blake's gone to so much effort to make sure Evan's not making this decision under duress. Rose has not gotten any of that consideration.
Yeah, why would he consider her? Come on, let's be reasonable here.
On the other hand, like Blake's right. This is, Evan's about as good a familiar companion as they've found for the starters.
Yeah.
But then also, Blake is also kind of doing it under duress a little bit as well. He had sort of made this decision anyway, but it really does. It is a now or never type thing. And she does kind of need to make the decision right now, and that's not fair, but that's also not entirely Blake's fault. So it is just sort of the situation.
Yeah. I think I agree with Blake here, although I don't know, Evan is the first familiar that has been nice, right? Like, not the first familiar, the first other. He's obviously a bit of a different case, and so I can kind of see the point that the Blake and Evan thing could be, puppy love. It's Blake's first real relationship with an other that isn't that has happened, right? Like, I don't know.
Yeah. And I think one of the best parts of this little argument is the ending, where Rose calls Blake an asshole, and again, fair. And then Blake responds with, well, I'm not really me at the moment. And Rose retorts that it might be the opposite, and maybe he's the most him right now.
Yeah.
And then she just, with that, she leaves, which is a great
solid
slam the
exit
door.
line.
And I think Blake's next thought is that he went to go and see Evan, and he was really angry.
Good way to start a relationship.
Doesn't point out that she was wrong. But yeah, it's a great moment.
Yeah. So Blake again gives Evan a chance to back out of this, and Evan decides, no, I'm in. I'll become your familiar. They kind of swear their undying love to each other, and this does seem to win Rose over a bit. Rose gets the book, and Evan starts reading off the ritual to bind himself to Blake.
Yeah, I mean, I think Evan would be hard to hate. I have to imagine that Evan and Rose probably will get along, because, I like both of them as characters, so I'll be upset if they don't. But I think it would be hard to hate Evan, so I think this conversation between him and Blake probably does win her over a little bit. There's an interesting bit where Evan kind of calls Blake out a bit and is like, why aren't you picking Rose? And Blake was like, oh, well, I don't want to pick Rose just because she's there.
Yeah, I have to say as well, I don't think Rose would want to be Blake's familiar. Like, I think she would see that as binding herself more in the slave owner relationship. I don't know.
Well, it's a tricky thing, because at the moment she's kind of already there. She's getting all of the cons of the familiar relationship and none of the perks. So there's an argument there, but you're right. Familiar is making her his familiar would be making it permanent. Whereas I think they're both kind of still holding out hope that they can break their current bond a little bit.
I imagine if their bond does get broken, I don't know. I don't think they'd want to stick around together, right?
No, I think they'd stay in touch, but more like cousins than
exactly
than what they are now. But anyway, so Blake does quickly mention to Evan that, like, oh, well, he doesn't want to pick Rose because she's just there, and I think this comes across as a really nice sentiment. But the more I thought about it, it's like that is also explicitly saying that he doesn't want her as his familiar, because if she was just there, but he did really like her, then he probably still would make her his familiar. So he is avoiding saying that he doesn't want her as his familiar.
Yeah, definitely.
Which we said Rose wouldn't want to be his familiar, but I think this is Blake also kind of telling us that he wouldn't want Rose either. It's a mutual decision. Yeah.
But Blake and Evan do seem to be a good fit, right? Blake has this desire to do good that's so... I wrote naive in my notes, but that's probably not the right word. Like
pure?
Innocent.
Pure,
maybe? Pure. He very much does want to do good, right? He has this simple view of morality. Things are capital G good or capital B bad, and Blake is going to do capital G good. And Evan, quite nicely fits this. Evan has said he wants to make the bad things go away, right? So they do fit together well in their motivations.
Yeah, and as we've touched on, and as they've touched on, they've got there's similarities in their bad days. So, yeah, I mean, they do make quite a good pairing.
Yeah. There's also another very touching moment where Blake makes Evan promise that once Blake is gone, once their bond is broken, Evan will agree that he's done good and he can move on. He will, he deserves to be at rest, and once this bond is done, Blake makes him promise that he will go and seek rest. He will pass on.
Yeah, you're right. It's very touching, and Blake has to sort of twist Evan's thumb to get him to do it, but it's such like a selfless move by Blake in a way, like kind of forcing Evan to be kinder to himself. Like he makes Evan's big promise be that he will be like fairer on himself.
I think we talked about seeing your flaws in other people. I think Blake does see a flaw that he and Evan seem to share, which is, self-sacrifice, right? Like the heroic sacrifice. And Blake says to Evan, hey, you can do this heroic sacrifice for a bit, but, once I'm gone, it's time to stop doing that.
Yeah. Well, I just hope Blake doesn't put Evan in a situation where it's tough for Evan to actually believe he did good by the time his time with Blake is up. Because I know Blake definitely means to allow Evan to keep that promise, but Blake doesn't always get to do what Blake wants to do because everyone's trying to kill him.
Blake is not great at keeping those promises sometimes.
I'm cautiously optimistic, I guess.
Yeah, and the chapter ends there with Evan reciting the ritual.
Yeah, so presumably we'll start the next chapter as the ritual's ended.
Or, time skip 20 years ahead, and they're older now, and they've been working together for a long time.
Everyone lived happily ever after.
Yep, exactly. That's where the story ends, actually. This is the last chapter. So that's the end of not Pact. That was a joke, but it is the end of our episode. Almost. Before we wrap up, a little reminder. We're doing a discussion question. That question is, if a practitioner has vowed to serve a system, is it okay for them to break the rules of that system to help deal with magical entities the rules don't account for? So we were kind of thinking about Duncan when we wrote this, but we want to apply to things that aren't just policemen, any kind of system. Where is the line to break the rules of that system? Kind of keeping the spirit of the law but not the letter, perhaps, is another way to think about it.
Yeah, totally. And so same as last time. You can chuck your thoughts on that discussion question in the discussion thread for this chapter or the previous one, and we'll pull them all out for our 5.4 recording.
Yep. Yes. Before we get to that, though, we want to dive into some comments from this chapter, comments that were made 5 years ago when this chapter first came out.
Yeah.
Now, I've pulled out a little comment thread that I really want to jump into, which is something that I love doing, speculating. This speculation chain includes comments by Farmer Bob 1, Mian, Psycho Gecko, and more, all kind of speculating what animal shape Evan might take as a familiar. There's kind of a consensus of, he's loyal, he's something zippy and fast. Animals being thrown around include dog, monkey, bird, rabbit. Actually, I really like the idea of Evan being a rabbit familiar, except, we've had a few horrifying rabbit incidents lately, so maybe it doesn't have the best connotations.
Well, but Evan is, small, quick, and... as we saw with Duncan, where he screamed in his ear, he has a bit of bite, and that's what we've learned rabbits have as well.
Yeah, definitely.
So it is actually a pretty good fit, and a rabbit is a relatively normal animal to be bringing around with you, because that would be my biggest concern with a familiar is, if it's a dog or a cat, okay, but from memory, Rose Senior's mother had like a snake or something, which isn't the most mobile of pets normally.
Sandra Duchamp has a stoat, also not a bit of a weird one, but I guess you can kind of conceal it.
Wait, what's a stoat again? I've completely forgotten.
It's like a weasel thing.
Yeah,
it's like a weasel, basically. Sandra's one of those people that you see sometimes who are carrying around weasels with them. Yeah. Anyway, I love this kind of speculation stuff, so I just thought I'd pull that out.
Yeah. Well, I guess we'll find out pretty soon from the looks of it. Yeah, and so I've pulled out a comment by Enjao. I think we've pulled one of their comments before and not figured out how to pronounce their name, but
we'll get it next time.
So Enjao brings up a few points. They brought up the Rose point we sort of touched on about how it's a big deal that Rose can now act out of the mirror. and
definitely.
how Blake is falling for that trap that we heard about in 4.x, trying to be a good diabolist. But I think the really interesting idea that they brought up was their last one, which is we kind of skimmed over all the feathers that were popping out of Blake's tattoos as he was running around for most of this chapter.
As those birds were getting beheaded.
Yeah. And there are a few moments throughout the chapter where he runs around and sort of collects those feathers and keeps them because, Blake likes to hold on to anything magical he can get because he usually gets to use them. And so he grabs some of the feathers, and there's a fair few comments in this under this chapter speculating on the feathers and what they might be used for. But I really like this idea from Enjiao that they represent Blake's physical presence, because they're sort of coming off of him as he's entering this, or as he's sinking and slipping through these cracks. So maybe they're essentially pieces of Blake in the symbolic sense.
And the distilled Blake trinkets.
Yeah, and so basically what Enjiao points out is that having separate, distinct components of yourself might be useful when going up against an erasure demon. As ammunition or as a safety net to find more of yourself later. I don't know, but I like that idea. I just really enjoyed all the comments sort of going into the feathers and the tattoos and what they represent because it's a really fun topic right now.
Yeah, on the note of the erasure demon, Andrew also points out that ghosts might be the best possible allies there because the erasure demon is about making people forget things, and ghosts are incarnations of memories, which is an interesting point. I don't know, Blake might have accidentally stumbled into the perfect tools to fight this thing.
Yeah, well, I guess we're back to that whole, do you fight with or do you fight with the opposite? I guess
we'll see.
Yeah, have a bit of both. It's probably a good idea.
Yes. But that's the end of Conviction 5.3 of our discussion about it, at least. Thank you everyone for joining us. Remember, get your answers to those discussion questions into our discussion thread, which will be linked in the episode description down below.
Yes, and if you're enjoying this show and any of the other shows on the Doof Network, please head to patreon.com/doofmedia. This podcasting network is entirely backer-based, and we really count on everyone's donations to keep the microphone lights on.
Yeah, I mean, one tangible example is when we were just doing this show with just the two of us, we had it as, we had it hosted on our own shitty little server, and that meant that sometimes when a new episode came out, some people would have errors downloading it because our server couldn't handle the load. Now that we are a part of the Doof Media Network, we are getting some money from people like you, hopefully, who are backing the network, and that means we can make our server more stable and make sure that, all these things that do go into delivering a podcast or the technical side can be more covered. So yeah, if you enjoy all the content that the Doof Media Network produces, why not prove it, huh? Put your money where your mouth is and check out the Patreon.
Yes, and while you're hopefully doing that, don't forget to stop by Wildbow's Patreon, patreon.com/Wildbow, and send some money his way because he's writing all these fantastic stories.
Yes, he does all these cool things that allow us to spend hours every week talking about them and enjoying them. So definitely check that out. And if you want to hear more from us, I'm afraid you'll have to wait until we do our episode on 5.4, which will be coming out on Wednesday, the 17th of April. So we'll see you then.
See ya.